Denver Broncos pass rusher Randy Gregory could miss some time in the offseason as he deals with shoulder surgery. Will he be ready for the start of training camp? Plus, could the Broncos play in the International Series in 2022? And the Broncos, they're rising up in the power rankings here in the offseason. Where do they go and how do they make the biggest jump? You get that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us, we covered the Denver Broncos for the Locked On Network and 9 News Broncos country. Thank you for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format. You can also get us here on YouTube in 4K, high definition. Every single day we have a brand new video, brand new show for you, the avid listeners across Broncos country. It would mean the world if you would hit that subscribe button and make sure you turn on notifications so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. Sayre, it's great to see you, my friend, here for another episode of the show. Some interesting news developing here for this Denver Broncos football team. One of their key free agent signings, Randy Gregory, he's undergoing arthroscopic shoulder surgery on his rotator cuff. And this kind of came as a surprise, I think, to people in Broncos country. But according to the Denver Broncos, they knew this was coming.
And I think that's a good thing, right? This is the time to get your scopes done. This is the time to go and get any sort of procedure done that you need to get done, because really when you want players ready is training camp. It's kind of okay for players to miss the offseason program. Obviously not ideal, but I'm sure Randy Gregory will be able to be there in person and be able to kind of do the walkthroughs, get his reps on the field, maybe not going full speed or anything, no contact or anything like that, but just kind of get some reps one way or the other. So
Yeah.
I think obviously if they knew about this going in, it's no big deal. And I think that's obviously, it does on one hand though, Cody, it does add a little bit to that risk factor that we've talked about with Randy Gregory before. I mean, whether suspension or injuries, we haven't really seen him play a full season in the NFL. So obviously this is something the Broncos were comfortable with, which I think gives me a little peace of mind. George Paton deserves the benefit of the doubt here. So That's what I'm banking on at this point.
I think it's all about the mental reps, right? You mentioned Randy Gregory. Look, if he can't physically participate during the team's offseason program, what he can do is he can go there, he can watch, he can still hear the terminology, he can be there in the meetings, and he might be able to do some cardio stuff. But, I mean, Sayre, we've seen medical technology advance so much. I mean, Cam Akers came off of an Achilles tear in 5 months. I imagine Randy Gregory's going to be A-okay when it comes to, an arthroscopic procedure on your shoulder. I mean, really, arthroscopic means minimally invasive. So it's not like they're going to have to cut open his entire shoulder, fix everything. They're just going to repair some tissue, things like that. It always happens here. But I think, does this raise the concern for maybe what we've talked about here? Obviously with Randy Gregory, but more importantly, why maybe the Broncos need to add another edge rusher here in the free agency period. I know it's the dead part, and really the deals the guys you're going to get aren't as high market value, and they're also probably not going to be high-quality starters, but you have to bank on the fact that there might be somebody out there who is a key rotational piece, or do you just hope and pray that the Broncos look in the NFL draft for a potential edge rusher, knowing that they pick at the back end of round 2?
Well, I think it's both and from my perspective, Cody. If there's a ring chaser out there off the edge that wants to come and play for the Denver Broncos, I've mentioned that before. I feel like the edge rush position is one of those where, like, towards training camp and towards the end of training camp and preseason games, you start to see some of these ring chasing pass rushers sign on with other teams, because what is it they do best? It's kind of like a 3-point specialist in the NBA. You go out and you get guys that can shoot, right? And in the NFL, it's pass rush specialists. You go out and get guys that they just can go out there and they can get after the quarterback. Guys like Justin Houston, Melvin Ingram, they're still available as free agents. And yes, they are older, but at the same time, they might be willing to sign for a very minimal price at this point. And I do think you need to go to the NFL draft. I was just looking at a mock draft scenario, Cody, getting into that round 2, round 3, round 4, that range there where the Broncos have 5 selections between rounds 2 and 4. There's some opportunities there. If the players that are available in the mock draft simulators, Cody, if they're sitting there when the Broncos are actually on the clock, I think they're going to be in really good shape.
I'm excited to see what George Payton's plan is for edge rusher. I know we still have Malik Reed on the roster here for Denver. I mean, obviously you have Jonathan Cooper. I feel like with everything that's happened, I've been very guilty of forgetting about Jonathan Cooper, and he was a damn good player last year. He had me super excited. So there is that angle to kind of keep an eye on here if you are the Denver Broncos. But Broncos country, we're going to dive into that conversation a little bit more as we get a little bit more information. How long might Randy Gregory be out for the Broncos this offseason? Will he be ready for training camp? He is expected to be ready for the start of the week 1 regular season. And could that be a Thursday night opener on the road against the Los Angeles Rams? There's been some talk about that, Sayre. I'll be very intrigued. But there's also been some talk about the Broncos potentially playing in the International Series game. Well, Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, though, we're going to discuss whether Mexico City or London are more appealing for the Denver Broncos to play in 2022. You get that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode of the show. And after months of playing, college basketball has determined the top teams for the Final Four and will determine this year's national champion this coming week. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and your sports information, from all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, including live betting in your favorite Vegas casino games. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Broncos country, as we get into the second half action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Once again, thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, be sure to check out the Locked On NFL YouTube channel. All the local experts on the biggest stories in one place. Check out the Locked On NFL YouTube page here on youtube.com/Locked On NFL. Check it out today. But Sayre, my friend, there's been some appeal. There's been some buildup about the Denver Broncos potentially being one of the teams that plays in an international series game. Now, we know for the most part who's going to play somewhere. We don't know the other opponent, right? We don't know exactly who the game is because the schedule has not yet officially been released. We just know the teams that will be playing in London, in Munich, and also in Mexico City. Could the Denver Broncos be one of those teams that have not yet been named yet? And there's 2 appeals right now, Sayre. And the Broncos have been big on this initiative here in the last week. Mexico City is growing in popularity. Mexico, I believe, has one of the largest Broncos fan bases in the entire country. Out of all the teams, the Broncos are very popular in Mexico. So does it make sense? Because you just had Steve Atwater, you had Bradley Chubb go down to Mexico City to even just kind of talk with fans and talk about their importance of having a stronger impact and an initiative in Mexico. There's that, but then there's also the appeal of London, right? Because 2 years ago, Sayre, the Broncos were supposed to play the Falcons on the road in London. In your opinion, if you had to choose between the Broncos playing in Mexico City or London, where would you be leaning?
You know, I think you're absolutely right, Cody. The fan base in Mexico City and Mexico in general is humongous, and we saw the response to that when the Broncos kind of announced, like, the NFL, every NFL team kind of got their country, right, where they're going to be represented heavily. And when Mexico got the Denver Broncos, I mean, the fans went nuts over it. So I think that obviously makes a ton of sense, and you can see that the league is really trying to get the Broncos involved back in the international, games that they do. I don't know that the Broncos have been to London other than their scheduled one during the COVID year. I don't know that they've been there for a long time. It's been a
The
long, long
49ers
time.
game where they
The 40,
lost. Ugh.
where they got caught cheating. That's right. That's the one that I was thinking of. So
Josh
that was the whole
McDaniels.
downward spiral for Josh McDaniels, who now is back in the West. So crazy, crazy times indeed. But yeah, the NFL, I mean, now that the Broncos have a star player, especially Russell Wilson at the QB position, I feel like getting that brand into the international market is going to be hugely, hugely important. Russell Wilson is a very popular player. The Denver Broncos are popular regardless of how good they are. But now you combine those two things, Russell Wilson and the Denver Broncos. I feel like the Mexico City game probably makes the most sense for the Denver Broncos, but getting them to London, not a bad idea either. And hey, you got the real life Ted Lasso as your head coach. You might as well send him out to London and see what he can do out there.
Well, I think it's important that you mention those 2 things, like Russell Wilson, the NFL. My biggest gripe, I think, with the NFL International Series is that they've always kind of sent, no offense to these other teams, but they've always kind of sent like the bottom tier teams in the NFL overseas. It's like, if you want to expand the national audience wider, send those fans a really good marquee matchup with superstars like, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson now. Now, Joe Ellis, Broncos CEO, he wants the Broncos to play one of the road games against the Jacksonville Jaguars in London this season. Not sure if that will be announced just yet. Not sure if that has any traction to it. But I think that there's a majority of Broncos fans who are split on this because there's a bunch of Broncos fans in Florida that have been eyeing this game. That, hey, it's another road game. I want to go watch the Broncos play in Florida. We're going to make the trip, closer areas here in the U.S. And then there's also the fan base, overseas. That's like, I saw some fan tweet out that, hey, I've been to 2 international games where the Broncos have played and they're 0-2 in those 2 games. So I don't know. Like, it's like, where do you want to go in that situation there? But it does make sense there. I think for London, especially having it, kind of being made up. I know we're good friends over there in Ireland. We have a bunch of Broncos fans in Ireland too that would have made the game in London. So, I mean, I think either way, if the Broncos can send their team that has these huge optics on them right now with Russell Wilson, a lot of star power now and a lot of excitement and a lot of hype, send those to an international series game. It builds the hype of the NFL brand even more. It's smart money. And look, the NFL, as we all know, Sayre, it's all about the money-making process. But we won't know the schedule really probably till the end of April. Well, actually, the end of April is the NFL draft. So probably like the second week of May, we might find out what the schedule release will be. We'll have complete breakdown and reaction here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. I like that, though. I think that it's on brand for where the Broncos need to be growth-wise going forward. So for me, Sayre, I don't know, like, could the Broncos maybe play 2 international series games? Like, could they go play a team in Mexico City and then go play a team in London in the same year? I don't know if that's feasible for what the NFL wants in terms of the requirement. I know that each team in the NFL will have an obligation in the next 8 years to go play an overseas game. That's been something that's been really documented by the National Football League. How do you feel about that potentially as a scenario? Would you be okay with the Broncos going there? Because, look, I don't think much changes. I believe that one of the conversations is that the altitude is really high down there in Mexico City. So it's kind of like a home game there for the Broncos in a sense. And obviously with the big fan base of Broncos fans down in Mexico, it makes sense to make it a home game for them.
It does. It does. It would be tough to take away a home game in Denver, but at the same time, if you can get that kind of that fan base behind you, that's kind of the thing I think about Wembley and London. It's like the fans are just there to watch football. It's not necessarily like, oh, this is a huge Denver Broncos following, which I think there would be. Like you mentioned, we've seen tons of like Broncos Europe and all those different people on Twitter. There's so many international fans over there in Europe, and I think that's awesome. So I think that there would be a big Broncos following, but that's always the one thing for me, Cody, that I look at. If the Broncos are involved in the international game, when they were scheduled against the Falcons, the number one thing that I looked for was, is that a Falcons home game or is it a Broncos home game? Because I don't want the Broncos losing a home game. Yeah. But at the same time, if they do go to Mexico City, where that's kind of understood to be like, the Broncos, that would be their home spot really for this type of series. I feel like that would be okay. That would be an okay compromise, especially because now you've added an additional regular season game already. So that might be kind of considered your 17th game or whatever. Like, this is a neutral site. So I would be okay with that from that perspective, especially now that it's not, well, you only have 7 home games now and 8 road games plus a neutral site game in the regular season. Oof. I feel like you can really get NFL teams on board with this now because you have that 17th game on a neutral site to say, hey, you're going to definitely be doing at least one international game over the next couple of seasons.
Oh, we'll see for the Denver Broncos. They've been a team that's been on the road before. The last time, as you mentioned, was all the way in London, taking on the San Francisco 49ers in that debacle of a game. Kyle Orton at quarterback, and unfortunately, I think that's when Brandon Lloyd was still balling a little bit for the Broncos. I remember that. Outside of that, was a game I'd like to forget because I was not very happy when the Broncos lost that game to San Francisco. But Broncos country, when it comes to the offseason, when it comes to power rankings, the Denver Broncos have had a huge rise in a multitude of different outlets' power rankings for the offseason. Where do the Denver Broncos come in NFL.com's? We get to that coming up here in just a moment. But real quick, let me tell you about this. If you are a Colorado sports fan, you need to make sure that you're checking out all the other Locked On podcasts we have for you here. If you're a Denver Nuggets fan, we have the Locked On Nuggets podcast hosted by Adam Mares and Matt Moore. We have the Locked On Rockies podcast hosted by Paul Holden. And if you are a Colorado Avalanche fan, we have you covered with the Locked On Avalanche podcast hosted by Chris Maselli and Kyle Sullivan. Be sure to check it out, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts. The Locked On Podcast Network, keeping pro sports fans close to the teams that they root for. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, we're going to get into the conversation now a little bit about power rankings. And yes, I get it. Power rankings, they're just opinionated pieces. But you know what? It's nice to see the Denver Broncos getting some respect for some of the moves they've made so far this offseason. And Sayre, I tell you what, some traction picking up here for this Denver Broncos team initially. And Dan Hansis, NFL.com, power rankings for the offseason. The Broncos were initially at 23. They rose from 23 all the way to number 8 in the power rankings simply off of the Russell Wilson move alone, combined with obviously Randy Gregory and DJ Jones. In your opinion, like how does this make you feel like from an optics perspective, seeing that the Broncos are getting a little bit of love now that Russ is the quarterback?
Well, Cody, you asked me to get a whiteboard the other day, so I put together this little rudimentary drawing during the last ad read here.
That's
That's
great.
that's the Broncos going straight to the moon, baby. Power rankings. I absolutely love it. I think that it reflects exactly what has happened. The Broncos have become a legitimate contender, a top 8 team, elite 8 to reference the March Madness that we're amidst with the NCAA basketball tournament. But the Broncos send them to the moon, man, in all the power rankings. I would put them in the top 5 personally. I think top 8 is respectable from kind of a national perspective. Maybe certain analysts or people that cover the NFL in its entirety, you don't get an opportunity to really deep dive every single roster. So, I give them the benefit of the doubt there, but I think the Russell Wilson move is going to move the needle for everybody in terms of power rankings. So to see them rise from a bottom 10 team, right? 23rd is bottom 10, and then all the way up to number 8, a top 10 team. You love to see that. But I think in terms of offseason rankings, the Broncos, the way that they have built this roster over the last 2 years, we've mentioned George Paton voted as the best draft in the league in 2021. And now you get Russell Wilson to come in to a roster that was already considered really strong. I send the Broncos to the moon. Here we go. Let's look at it one more time. Send them to the moon, baby.
That is a great drawing too, by the way, that you did. Like, there's no way I could have freehand drew that at all. Like, I'm a terrible drawer, my friend. So, hey, that is impressive. I love that. That's going to be our thumbnail picture there is that. And we'll hold that up eventually here for the show. But, outside of that too, I think some people always ask the question when we talk about power rankings, why discuss offseason power rankings? Sayre, I think perception is important, especially in the offseason, because sometimes people tend to forget. Look, the Broncos, before they acquired Russell Wilson, there was no excitement. Like, I can tell you this, a majority of Broncos fans were not excited about this offseason. They were not excited about next season because there were so many uncertainties about who could be the quarterback, whether or not you wanted to go in the NFL draft with any of these prospects. Are there any guys that could become a franchise guy? There was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of just, I'd say, cloud, doom and gloom from Broncos country, and rightfully so. The on-field product has not been acceptable in terms of a losing record the last several seasons. And now you get a guy that comes in and completely transforms the optics of the national media perception. I mean, there's guys on ESPN, which I hate giving knowledge to those guys, but they're giving the Broncos credit and they're talking about them, which kind of makes me sick in a sense because I don't want them to jinx it. Like, I feel like that's the ultimate jinx waiting to happen. Like when Colin Cowherd was all like, I'm all in on Drew Lock, dark horse, MVP candidate. We all saw how that all, worked out for the Broncos. Things just went downwards. So we discussed the offseason power rankings because I do think that the perception on the Broncos has changed. But now, Sayre, talking about perception here, are the Broncos the most improved NFL team on paper, in your opinion? Why or why not?
I think there's definitely a case to be made, in terms of looking at some of the top teams making the offseason moves that they have in 2022. I don't know that any other team, Cody, has upgraded as substantially as the Denver Broncos at the quarterback position. I think they've made the biggest move there. I think they've obviously gotten a couple of really good free agents, key free agents on the defensive side. And now you still have 8 or 9 draft picks. I don't know exactly how many they have. George Paton says 9. Draft sites say 8. We'll find out, I guess, during the NFL draft when it officially goes down. But there's just so many assets for this team to continue improving. And now we're into the bargain side of free agency. So now you might be adding some more bargain free agents. I just don't think any team in the league has upgraded as much as the Denver Broncos in terms of, adding Russell Wilson. You said it. 23rd to 8th in these NFL.com power rankings, but everywhere else around the league, the Broncos are getting due respect. And I think that's great. I think it's great to see. It is like, it makes you wonder, like, remember the Sports Illustrated jinx? You're like, don't put the Broncos on the cover of Sports Illustrated, dang it. Remember the Daniel Graham cover when they were 6-0 back in 2009? I'm like,
Oh,
why
man.
did you put Daniel Graham on the cover of Sports Illustrated? You just ruined it. You just blew it. So I think, but definitely the Broncos deserve due respect. And I think on paper, in my opinion, I would say they are the most improved team in the NFL this offseason.
I think that's fair. And I think that Miami Dolphins fans would probably, if they're ever watching this, make sure y'all check out Locked On Dolphins. You're a Dolphins fan somehow watching a Broncos podcast. But I think the optics too, I go back to Sports Illustrated, like you mentioned, even Paxton Lynch, after he was drafted, I was like, oh no, here we go. Like there was that was in my dentist office one time. And I was like, oh, I just can't. Like they left it there. Like even after a year and a half, it was still there. I was like, why is this even here? Like, come on, you got to replace these magazines. But I mean, I agree. I think that the optics, the perception of Denver has changed in the eyes of the national media. I know local media, all of us, we are excited, Sayre, for what the Broncos can do here in 2022. And Broncos country, let us know your thoughts on where you'd have the Denver Broncos in your own personal offseason power rankings. Drop your own power rankings in the comment section down below, 1 through 32. Organize it. We can't wait to share and respond here on youtube.com/Locked On Broncos. But thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in to today's episode, Locked On Broncos. That will do it for today's episode of the show. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Now for your second listen, make sure you go check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast hosted by Ryan Tracy and Eric Crocker, former NFL cornerback, as they break down all the prospects and they build you up and get you ready for the NFL Draft. You can get that free and available everywhere you get your podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network.